defining mental health and well-being and sort of the importance around that, and some important distinctions as well. We'll then be looking at athlete mental health, how sport can impact mental health in both a positive but also sometimes a negative way. And then we'll be thinking about how you guys can support athletes with their mental health and well-being. And I know there's people in kind of different roles, and maybe when we get into the discussion, perhaps if everyone just shares what their roles are, so we kind of know where everybody's at and coming from, I think that would be quite useful. So in terms of just a bit of a background about me, essentially, so I've got 2 degrees in psychology. So I did my undergraduate degree in psychology at Coventry University before moving on to do my master's degree in sport and exercise psychology, so specialising at that point at Loughborough. And then after that, I went to do a qualification. I finished this year for a couple of years, which essentially means that you're then a chartered sport and exercise psychologist, so you're fully qualified. So I did that with the BPS. And throughout that time and kind of moving on from that, I've worked with quite a range of organisations and teams and individuals. So I run my own consultancy company. So within that, I work with lots of different, sort of mostly individuals in sport, particularly in archery, because that's my sport. And I've competed in archery at sort of international level as a junior. So I kind of get quite a lot of archery work really, and hopefully feel that I can kind of bring that applied experience and experience of actually, feeling under pressure and competing at various levels. Hopefully I can bring that to sessions and just, I guess, give it more context. We've also worked with organisations like the FA. I'm still working with them now. And sort of as a kind of byproduct of that, I'm working with the Wheelchair Football Association, because I work with one of their para football teams, one of their England teams, quite regularly. So doing work in that sort of para population has been really interesting over the last couple of years. I also do work with Swim England, doing consultancy for them, and work with places like Birmingham City University, working with scholars and things like that. So that's been kind of growing over the past few years, but hopefully you'll get a sense that I've worked with a range of individual and team sport athletes, but also coaches as well, and parents. I think a lot of people think about sports psychology as just working with the athletes, and that is a big part of the role, but then also thinking about actually how can you as a coach or someone working in sport benefit from sports psychology within your role to help you perform at your best, but also to help you support athletes in that environment as well, kind of regardless of your role really. So hopefully today you'll feel that all of the content is relevant to you, whatever your role may be. We certainly feel that way in terms of thinking about the mental health and well-being of athletes. But yeah, so that's just a bit of a background on me. And I should also say I'm actually studying now for a PhD in athlete mental health as well, which is good for today's session. So I should know my stuff if I've been working hard over the past year, starting my PhD on that. Okay, but we're going to start off with, so we were obviously going to do a breakout room, but maybe we'll just have a group discussion for a few minutes, just to kind of start thinking about what is mental health and well-being. And I really wanted to just kind of get your initial thoughts before I kind of deliver anything, just to see sort of where you're at in terms of what your understanding and experiences of mental health and well-being, maybe both inside and outside of sport are. So if people just are happy to pop their microphones on and can kind of share their thoughts, you can use the raise a hand function if you want, or I'm sure because there's not many of us, you can just kind of go for it and share your thoughts.
I don't mind kicking off, Erin. In addition to my role at LRS, I work with the FA as well in their disability player pathway, and it's something that we try and make a really big part of the players' experience when they're on camp with us. Is that kind of the psychological side of the game, and it's something that they have access to. throughout the weekends that we have on camps and whenever they're with a team, that they have access to a psychologist. But just I think that just sport in general can really, I know it's certainly helped me, particularly in the last few months, getting out and going for a run, but also that from their point of view, being part of a team and feeling that they're part of something beyond just their own sport at home, I think is really, really good for them.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for kind of kicking us off. And I think, thinking about today's session, a lot of it we can definitely sort of relate to this year in particular. So kind of good to bring it back to this year. But did anyone else want to share kind of what their, I guess what their idea of mental health and wellbeing means, particularly in sport?
I think in terms of kind of my area of work, me and Georgia are the assistant graduates in our health and wellbeing teams within councils. Sure. So I think the biggest thing, I personally don't have a lot of interaction with professional athletes, more local level athletes that maybe train on a weekly basis for their local tennis club, or haven't even started physical activity in any sense. So it's kind of breaking the very start of that kind of process of getting into sport and physical activity. And I think the biggest problem or barrier at the moment is the fact that people aren't self-aware. They don't understand why they don't take part in physical activity. So it's just kind of that initial process of, we all work in a similar area of, physical activity and wellbeing. So we understand the importance of mental health and wellbeing, but it's kind of reiterating that to residents on a local level that don't have that background. And I think that can be a barrier because, it's like trying to, sell someone something that they really don't want. It's very difficult. So I think it's just really dependent on the individual we're trying to engage.
No, that's a good point. And I think that's why it'd be interesting to hear what everyone's sort of roles are, and kind of, I guess, where you kind of fit in, what populations you're sort of in contact with and working with, and again, hopefully, although we are sort of thinking about, I guess it's termed athletes in this session, it can definitely be applied to just anybody in sport and physical activity. It might need adapting slightly, or we might need to think about things in a slightly different way, just in terms of how you interact with people, or where maybe you come in contact with them. But definitely, the content for today's session will be relevant to lots of different settings. But thank you for sharing. And then anyone else want to kind of discuss what they feel mental health and wellbeing is or involves in sport, how you would maybe describe it? Anyone want to kind of add to that at all?
Hi, Owen. I'm one of the placement students at LOS, but outside of that, I do quite a bit of coaching around cycling, especially with the uni. So I guess I'm coming from this from a more coach perspective, and a lot of like student athletes, that kind of thing. But I think mental health can be positive and negative. It doesn't have to always be good. It can also be bad. And I think part of working with students as well, you're kind of discovering that for the first time. There might be new pressures that surround itself in sport, and also just trying to balance that student life and athlete life as well. I think it can come from many areas of sort of your life, from your social, sport, and sort of come together and create your sort of your overall health mentally. That's just one of the perspectives I have.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing. And it's good also to have it from that coach perspective. And interesting that you sort of mentioned, that mental health can be good, it can be not so good, and we'll look at that in a moment and look at kind of any key distinctions, and that's going to lead us into sort of starting to define what we mean by mental health and wellbeing. But thank you for sharing. Does anyone else just want to add anything in before we move on and start discussing it at all?
Hi Erin. I'm also a placement student with LRS this year, but I study at Loughborough, and I play netball, and I do quite a lot. I train alongside some of the Loughborough Lightning players who obviously play National League, and it's interesting to see, how they have to be very self-aware of their moods during, obviously, leading up to the season, and especially with having to almost timetable your life a bit, taking that time to focus on their mental health, because a lot is focused around, getting physically ready. But it's when you kind of break through that level from, say, regional to national, where you need to start focusing a lot more on the mental side as well, and be resilient.
Definitely. And I think that's really interesting, and like you said there, scheduling your life, it's other aspects of your life as well with that sport, and how things maybe change as you progress through sport with the sort of demands that you face, definitely. And we'll come on to that a bit more as well later on, when we're looking at what the sort of demands of sport are and how we can support athletes and other people working in sport to manage those. So that's great. Thank you very much for sharing, Charlotte. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to bring up now a couple of definitions, and I don't think we need to get too kind of bogged down with really knowing the definitions of mental health very specifically, but I thought it's just a kind of good starting point to kind of develop our understanding. So if we think about mental health, so the definition here by the World Health Organization is that it's a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So that's kind of where we're starting from today in terms of thinking about mental health. So for me, kind of the key points are, thinking about coping with those normal stresses of life, like Charlotte kind of said there, managing your sport within your life and your timetable, realizing your own sort of abilities and your capabilities, and feeling like they can make a contribution. And that does lead in very much into sport, even though that is sort of like a generic non-sport based definition. But also important to look at, just move this over here for a sec, is mental illness as well. And that's something that we'll be thinking about a little bit today. And as Max was saying, obviously mental health can be good or it can be not so good. And so here we really want to be clear on how we're defining and how we're talking about mental health and mental illness. So mental illness is defined by the American Psychological Association as a clinically significant behavioural or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual. And that tends to be for an extended period of time. So that would be sort of weeks leading into months, would be when you're looking at someone having a mental illness. And so we're at the point now really where we're looking at mental health in terms of consisting of more than just the absence of disease or a disorder. And we're really thinking about that emphasis on that well-being, individual potential and flourishing. So we're very much looking at it as something that's positive rather than sort of just being the absence of feeling sort of mentally unwell. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that, or any questions at any point before I sort of move on? Anyone need any clarification? Okay. So in terms of mental health in a sporting context, so those definitions were quite, again, sort of non-sporting context, although still relevant. So we're thinking about things like well-being, obviously realising their potential in sport, coping with competitive demands, so with maybe moving on from just sort of general life demands, although that is a part of obviously being an athlete, but now moving on to thinking about those competitive demands, as Charlotte was saying, maybe particularly as they're progressing to a higher level of sport, coping with those normal life stresses, feeling able to make a contribution to the team, and then ability to seek support when required. And that's one of the key points we'll be looking at today in terms of how we can play a part in ensuring that all people in sport, but particularly athletes, can seek that support they need when they need it. And so when we're thinking about these definitions, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about why these are so important. And there's often many misconceptions surrounding mental health and mental illness. And I think, when we're talking about mental health, kind of like Max was saying again, you know, it can be good, it can be bad. Whereas I suppose what we're now trying to say is we've got mental health where this is us being healthy, this is us flourishing, this is us, you know, feeling like we're doing well. And then we've got mental illness, which I would say is kind of at a more, potentially more severe end of the scale. So what we find now is research suggests that mental health is on a continuum. So we're not purely kind of, we've got mental health or we haven't, or we're, you know, healthy or we're not. It's more, we're all on a continuum somewhere, and obviously that will fluctuate and change over time, just depending on lots of different factors. So we really want to be clear when we're thinking about mental health and illness that those two things are very separate. And I think that that's quite important when communicating with athletes about mental health. And we want to create a common understanding of what we're addressing, which is why I wanted to start today with looking at definitions and really making sure we're on the same page when we're talking about these topics. Because what we found is a lack of understanding can impact how individuals manage their mental health or indeed manage the mental illness. So for example, that can lead to things like stigma, which we'll come on to in a moment, lack of help-seeking behaviours, so not going and getting in touch with the appropriate person to gain support and get a bit of help. Maybe also things like feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment, and all of those things are kind of wrapped up in that stigma as well, is feeling like they maybe shouldn't need to seek support, and we'll come on to how that particularly affects athletes as well. So again, like I've said, it's just important to clarify those differences between that mental health and mental illness so that we know what we're talking about. And I think often when you talk to people about mental health, or when you say we're doing a session on mental health, I think a lot of people instantly actually think of mental illness. I think they go to think of things like depression, like anxiety, and kind of think of it at that end of the scale, rather than thinking, okay, we're going to talk about how we can maintain our mental health, how we can maintain our well-being over winter when the weather's miserable, or, you know, over lockdown and things like that. So we really want to try and make those differences clear to athletes, so that when we say, let's talk about your mental health, we're not necessarily saying, do you have an issue? We're saying, let's just make sure that we're maintaining you from a mental point of view, just as we would from a physical point of view. Okay, so if we move on to just briefly talk about the benefits of sport and exercise on mental health and well-being. So the benefits are really well documented. There's a lot of research out there on the benefits, to the point where, you know, now we want to be looking at some of the other sides of sport, which we said earlier, can contribute to perhaps not necessarily mental ill health always, but just sort of challenges with mental health. But I just wanted to kind of briefly just recap over the benefits that I'm sure we're all familiar with. So thinking about things like building and maintaining social networks and sort of social skills. And I think particularly, I think for everybody really, but I think particularly when we're thinking about maybe youth sport, trying to develop social skills and interpersonal skills in young athletes. Development of life skills, which again I think can relate to anybody, but particularly in that youth sport, developing different skills that they may not get from other areas, and just making sure that they have sort of a balanced, I guess, a balanced life in terms of where they get their skills from, really. It can offer new life experiences and opportunities, so whether that's things like travel, meeting lots of new people, obviously being competitive and sort of experiencing the opportunities that can come with that. Obviously physical health as well, so if you're keeping your physical health you know, going well, then obviously that's going to help with your mental health, so they all link in together. Things like confidence and self-esteem, and I think those things can also be challenged by sport, which we'll look at in a moment, but I think it can be a real vehicle for you know, building individuals' confidence, building their self-esteem, particularly with a group that I work with a lot, sort of under the FA, so that thinking about the para football players that I've been working with, you know, for them, their sport really builds that confidence and that self-esteem, and you know, getting out of the house and being active in something and in a community. And I think that leads on quite well to thinking about their motivation and purpose and having challenge. And I think that's why perhaps over lockdown, so with that community in particular, they've not been able to train since March. They've all been shielding. So that's been quite difficult for them to maintain that motivation and that purpose and have, you know, that driving challenge day to day, because often for them, their sport is what provides those opportunities for them and that outlet. So I think it's really important to think about, obviously, all of these benefits of sport, but maybe also looking at the flip side of perhaps some of them and how maybe particularly this year that's been impacted. But it can also be relevant when we're thinking about things like injury, like retirement maybe, and how that can impact their mental health as well. Okay, so if we're thinking about mental health as a resource, and that's something I really want us to kind of start thinking about for today's session. So again, we want it to be viewed as a resource which allows individuals to thrive and to flourish. And so again, we want to kind of move away from this idea that mental health is kind of just us day to day and it's sort of just the everyday goings on. And again, that's moving away from the idea that I must be mentally healthy because I don't have a mental illness. That's not always the case. You know, we all have fluctuations in mood and how we're feeling day to day. So it's really trying to think about, particularly moving into sport, how can we sort of put mental health across as something that's positive, that we're proactively, you know, trying to maintain and to build on. And of course, mental health is involved in the success of individuals within sport, and that's various stakeholders, so not just athletes, obviously coaches, parents, carers, staff, support staff. And I think for me, it's really key to start linking mental health and well-being with success, because often I think in sport, and particularly elite sport, we can be perhaps a little bit guilty in the narrative we tell around sport about it being sort of all about that performance, the winning at all costs, it's the medals, it's the glory, and all those wonderful things. But often I think sport, or people in sport, can maybe feel that mental health kind of pitted against that. You either focus on mental health and well-being, or you focus on performance. And that's something for me that I need to consider in my role as a sports psychologist is, you know, a lot of the time you're brought in to enhance players' performance, which obviously is a big part of my role. But also for me, and this will be different for different psychologists depending on how they work, I also need to consider, well, how do I help athletes with their mental health and their well-being that goes hand in hand with that performance? And so trying to negotiate that can be quite tricky and quite interesting sometimes if we've got individuals, maybe particularly kind of coaches, head coaches in sport, who are particularly sort of performance driven, and that's what they're looking to you to support with. So I think it's trying to start linking the fact that to get that performance, that high level performance, we need to be thinking about factoring mental health into that, just as we would with physical health and physical fitness. And so, like I've kind of said, really considering mental health in this way helps well-being. And so thinking about athletes, obviously, you know, as people first and foremost, but it also does help with that performance. And I think, even though, I guess to me that seems like a no-brainer, but I think when you work in this kind of area, it's easy to forget how kind of well-versed you are and all this kind of stuff. You know, it really is kind of putting that across to many people in sport and trying to kind of spread that message, really, that, you know, they don't have to be considered separately. We want to consider them together, and actually that's going to help you bring in those medals, get that funding, you know, think about all those performance goals that we need to hit in sport. And so often what we find is thinking about well-being is actually just trying to kind of balance those challenges and using your resources. So if mental health is a resource that we can tap into and use to kind of combat those challenges, to manage those challenges, then that's what we're sort of looking for. And obviously this kind of fluctuates naturally for everybody, but what we really want to be trying to start thinking about is using our mental health and our well-being and how we can work on that as a resource to kind of be a protective factor against those challenges. So trying to kind of be that, I guess, barrier from all of these challenges that we can face in sport. Does anyone want to add anything in at that point? Any thoughts or any questions at all? As I'm aware, I've been talking at you for a while. No? Okay, cool. I'm going to talk at you for a bit longer then. Okay, so now we'll think about kind of the flip side, so mental health and wellbeing challenges in sport. And so obviously, you know, we've mentioned the benefits, and as I say, in research, they're really quite well researched and we're quite well versed in them. And what we actually find when we're looking to do more research, particularly in organisations, is we'll kind of go in as researchers and try to say, you know, let's look at some of the challenges that sport can bring on mental health. And often there can sometimes be resistance. I don't think from any individuals in particular, but there can sometimes be resistance, and they sort of say, you know, why don't you do research on how good it is for mental health, you know, how great swimming is for your mental health, or whatever it might be. And you think, yeah, but we kind of know all that now, you know, we know it's really good for you and good for your well-being. We actually now need to kind of have a bit more of a critical look at some of these challenges and how they can impact our athletes and various people in the environment. So I just want us to think about and just have a kind of brief discussion really on what maybe are the challenges that sport can pose on athlete mental health and well-being, but maybe also feed in from, if you're a coach, you know, from maybe your own perspective, if it can impact obviously coaches, volunteers, just sort of anybody in the environment really. So although I've put athletes, we can kind of open that up. I've set aside kind of 10 or so minutes for this. Obviously we were going to do breakout rooms, but we can kind of just discuss until we've kind of got all of our thoughts out. But does anyone want to start us off just thinking about maybe some of the challenges in sport to mental health and well-being?
Erin, I think one of the things that I feel a little bit working with some of the players that I work with is perhaps one of the challenges for them can be a little bit of pressure that those young players put on themselves, but also perhaps maybe things like parental pressure, and maybe even a little bit of pressure kind of put on by us as coaches and staff within that environment. You know, we're trying to encourage them that they do need to do things away from camp, you know, that they're very much responsible for their own improvement, their own development, and that is going to put pressure on it. It's perhaps pressure for the right reasons, but it's where it's interesting that you use that kind of that almost seesaw analogy there, that we're putting pressure on them for the right reasons to try and assist them to achieve their goals, but at the same time you put too much pressure on them, and does that then have the reverse effect that they almost become, you know, resistant to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think you know, of course there's always going to be an element of pressure in sport, and I think all of these discussions we have, you know, it's never about saying don't put athletes under pressure, don't sort of, you know, simulate competition even and get them sort of used to that environment. I think it's always looking at what's the appropriate level of pressure before we move on to actually, are we negatively impacting mental health and well-being, and we need to be aware of that, but also how can we support athletes to manage that pressure. And really that's what I feel is a lot of our roles in sport is providing that opportunity for those kind of pressured situations to play out and actually see, you know, how do they handle that, but how do we help athletes, particularly young athletes, to deal with that. And so I think, again, you know, trying to open up this conversation and for people not to feel, and for me especially as a psychologist coming in, that I'm gonna, you know, put the brakes on everything and say, you know, you can't put them under any pressure. We want it to be, you know, light and fluffy and nice all the time. You know, it's not the reality. And I think sometimes perhaps staff who obviously their role is to drive that performance and get those results, I think that can sometimes bring around some resistance, because they're thinking, oh gosh, you know, are we going to be taking a step back from applying that necessary pressure? So I think it is just about being aware that yes, we want to put them in those situations to an appropriate level. But we want to really then look at how are we then supporting them to manage that and develop in those scenarios, if that kind of makes sense. Yeah, cool. Does anyone else want to add in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot around, analysis. Everything is filmed and picked apart by different specialists. And particularly maybe in team sports, you might have a squad of 12, but then only 7 can play at one time. And so sometimes, it's comparing yourselves to other people. How can I make myself better to be in that starting lineup? And I think once you've got in the mindset of, I am an athlete, you want to then be the best. So you're not going to stop until, you can make it.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll come on to that in a moment, really looking at kind of that athlete identity and how that can impact us and what our perceptions are of, ourselves as athletes, or, what athletes should be capable of and what they should almost put up with as well. I think sometimes, maybe particularly moving into senior sport as well. But no, that's really, really interesting and kind of really important to look at those. And again, think, where is that line of, is this training really intensely and really hard, or is this kind of borderline, actually this is going to move into having negative implications for health or mental health? So it is kind of an interesting, I guess, balance to try and strike. But yeah, also definitely what you said there in terms of, competing against teammates almost to kind of make that cut and always feeling like everything is analysed. And again, I think that's probably coming back to, how do you put things across when things are analysed, or, how are we supporting athletes to sort of manage that maybe constructive criticism or that level of analysis, which, like you say, if it comes from lots of different angles, can be probably quite overwhelming. So just making sure that as people, if it's us doing the analysis, how are we putting across our feedback? And if we're working with athletes who are trying to cope with that, how do we help them to do that? But yeah, definitely kind of good points there. Anyone else want to kind of add in? So what are some other maybe challenges that can impact athlete mental health?
I'll just build on that point, if that's all right, Erin. Surrounding athlete identity within cycling at Loughborough, we kind of look at it as in there's sort of 3 main sort of identities that a student athlete might have, whether it's from the demands from your studies, the demands from your sport, and then obviously like your social life, and then you might have a part-time job on top of that. And I think at the top level within cycling at Loughborough, you kind of look at it, you can only do 2 very well. So a lot of them take the sport and the study as the top 2, but I think that can create a bit of tension, like especially if you miss out on the social. This is at the sort of more of the top level, I suppose, of cycling. But like, if you do miss on that social aspect of everyone else in your halls or on campus, or I think you can start to feel a bit isolated, especially in cycling when it's such like a individualized sport rather than a team sport. I think that sort of does put pressure on your mental health a bit, and it's just
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, like I say, we'll be looking a bit more at that athlete identity, but also, like you say, kind of balancing those kind of other identities as well. And, how much do we promote there sort of being a balance or, a bit of a trade-off sometimes. And I think, like you say, in that kind of top end of sport, the trade-off often can't be that performance and that sporting element. It's going to be something else, whether that is your education or your social life. And it also, like you're saying, that can have an impact on your well-being and that kind of lack of balance. And we often see that sort of playing out maybe in the years, obviously like this year, which is completely unprecedented, but at times like this where sport is absolutely everything and suddenly you can't do it, who are you, what are you then doing with this whole year, or injury as well, and retirement, but also maybe transitions from kind of junior to senior level, or different aspects of a pathway and things like that. And it can definitely sort of challenge those moments for athletes because it is so ingrained in their identity, which I think to some extent is part and parcel of sport, particularly at the elite end. But again, as people working in sport, we really need to think about how do we kind of set the tone in sport so that it's okay to have a bit of a social life. Yes, you know, you might not have as much of a social life as sort of someone who isn't training at an elite level, but you're allowed to have some balance. And that also comes into thinking about children as well, and all the kind of work around early specialization, and how early do you pick one sport that you're going to focus on for the rest of your life, and things like that. And so trying to strike that balance. But yeah, I definitely think that's a really interesting kind of can of worms that we could definitely open and talk about for a long time. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else kind of want to add anything, any other challenges you can think of at all?
I'd say kind of from what I've seen in some professional athletes, and especially student athletes as well, is making the time to kind of reflect positively on their mental health. You know, I've seen a lot of self-doubt, and like you say, and that is because of factors, you know, will they make the team? Is the coach approachable enough to be able to ask for those kind of updates and improvements?
Yeah.
To kind of, you know, go back and reflect on actually what went well in that session, or what went well in that game, and to give themselves you kind of that encouragement from within, rather than looking for that externally. And kind of, you know, giving yourself time to relax and get your head around, you know, with other factors like studying and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think kind of those last points you touched on there is kind of, again, it's coming back to that balance and giving yourself the time to manage that. And I think something you said was really interesting there was kind of not just sort of relying on things externally. So, you know, I think often athletes can get into that cycle of wanting or needing that praise or approval from a coach, or from maybe a staff member. And obviously, you know, that feedback is important, but it's also trying to get, from my perspective, athletes thinking about how can they maybe monitor their own performance or mental health and well-being. You know, how can they reflect on their training, how they're competing, how they're progressing, and of course liaise with coaches on that as well where they can. But like you said, really quite rightly, you know, not just relying on the external all the time for particularly things like the self-esteem and that confidence, because you're not always going to be able to sort of receive that maybe always from a coach, depending on their coaching style, depending on their capacity to support athletes kind of one-to-one, and lots of different things. So I think something I always try to encourage athletes that I work with to do is, yes, use that feedback from coaches as a valuable resource, but also have your own standards in a way, you know, have your own way of sort of evaluating your progress and your development, so that you can actually look, like you've quite rightly said, sort of internally and just, I guess, gain confidence from that. So you're not always looking to those other people who you can't always you know, rely on or always kind of control how they're going to manage situations, if that sort of makes sense. Yeah. Okay, cool. Does anyone have any kind of last points to feed in before we move on?
I was obviously just going to say there's a challenge around the media. Obviously, sport creates a lot of money for the economy, but also I think just the media in general likes to ostracize or kind of look at the faults in athletes rather than kind of celebrating, because it's perhaps more interesting to the reader, or like scrutinizing what went wrong and things like that. So that can contribute a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And again, you know, I think as well, we can also move into nowadays things like social media, you know, everything like that. And, you know, I was working with a client the other day who's saying, you know, I'm looking at all these other players sharing their skills on Instagram, and I'm looking and going, oh, you know, I can't do that. I'm thinking, God, you know, years ago, that wasn't even a thing. You couldn't even see what other people were up to. So there's definitely challenges in the media, definitely, you know, thinking about how do they manage that, particularly obviously getting towards that elite level. And also thinking about social media, how do we sort of support them with their sort of interactions with peers and with opposition and all those things. And I think, again, you know, that's quite clearly almost looking externally for that validation. And I think just generally social media is quite wrapped up in that external validation, you know, how many likes does my photo have, or whatever it might be. So I guess, again, you know, it's trying to encourage athletes where we can to really gain some confidence from that if they can, and if it's in a healthy way. However, not relying on, again, those external factors where actually, if you haven't got any likes on a video of you doing a skill in football or whatever it might be, that's not kind of soul destroying for you. It's just, you can get your confidence from other places. But yeah, there's definitely kind of a good point all about kind of media and those external influences for sure. I think you've put me to shame there with some of my ideas. You come up with some much more interesting ones. So if we kind of just have a look at these challenges then. So as we've kind of said, they're often exposed to these pressurized environments regularly throughout their careers. And that is why sort of that mental health and wellbeing is so important with athletes. And actually we find that, obviously depends person to person, but athletes are kind of exposed to that pressure fairly regularly, and perhaps more regularly than a lot of the general public. So we need to kind of think about how we help them manage those. So some of the types of stresses that can include, obviously, everything wrapped up in competitive stresses, so performance, expectation, whether that's our own expectations or those of parents and coaches and teammates and people like that. Maybe organisational stresses. So one thing we've not really mentioned is thinking about travel. How does that fit in with your life? Logistically managing that and all the things that involves. Personal, so again, kind of thinking about maybe personal life having just an impact because it kind of, I guess, seeps into everything often, doesn't it? Thinking about things like injury, so those kind of difficult time periods, and again, kind of retirement. I don't think many athletes have a walking stick at the age they retire, but that's the only sort of relevant little emoji I could find. But so thinking about those kind of difficult transition moments as well, and you've come up with many more great examples that would fit under probably quite a few of those kind of headings really, and really trying to understand the kind of challenges that athletes can face and how that might change over time throughout their careers, day to day as well, and then looking at, again, how can we support them in that, which can, I think, feel quite overwhelming when we're thinking about all the different types of stresses and things that can negatively impact athletes. So I think it's just important to try and kind of look at these things kind of one by one and, assess it on a case-by-case basis of how we can support athletes. But I think a lot of it is kind of setting the tone, as we'll see in a moment, of making sure they feel they can reach out for that support. So a lot of it is kind of laying that groundwork so that, yes, there might be those competitive stresses, there's going to be some stress with travel, there might be some injuries along the way, but actually we've set up an environment that can help you cope with that appropriately. And so just a kind of little fact there, so athletes are sort of as likely or sometimes more likely to actually suffer from mental illnesses more than the general population. So this is thinking about things like depressive disorders, but also particularly things like eating disorders. If we think about things like aesthetic sports, like gymnastics, or kind of weight-based sports, where obviously you need to make a certain weight for your category, and that is really quite common in terms of, I guess, that population compared to the general population. So it's just being aware of that, and that would be more the mental illness side of the scale. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talk about mental health stigma in sport. So we've got two main types of stigma. So the first type is public stigma. So this is when a community or population endorse negative stereotypes about mental illness. But then we've also got self-stigma, which I believe often does come from that kind of public stigma because of what's said in various environments. And this occurs when individuals living with mental illness sort of endorse and buy into those negative stereotypes about themselves as well. And that can occur. And I think, again, that's kind of down to that environment and how we kind of set the environment up. And just some kind of fictional points I thought I'd go through, because I come across these sort of recently, just kind of in research and things like that. And there can sometimes be a perception that mentally tough athletes don't experience mental illness. And I think in the last few years, there's definitely been this narrative around mental toughness, around resilience, and it kind of seems to be the latest buzzword. And there is a lot of kind of good research out there around things like resilience, but I think a lot of people perceive that mental toughness means you have no problems, you know, you have no challenges, you have no issues. And that isn't the case. Actually, when we are looking at resilience, it actually means that when you do come across these challenges and these problems, you have the sort of adaptability and the flexibility and the skills to cope with that appropriately and to get past them. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, that we're not necessarily saying, you know, if you're resilient, that you have no issues and that you've never faced a problem. It's about saying how can you overcome those challenges. So that's sort of one kind of fictional point that I just wanted to kind of address. And also in some instances, and hopefully kind of in more severe instances really, and not day to day, but features of mental illness can actually be considered as a characteristic of that great athlete. You know, when we were talking briefly about earlier, you know, I remember seeing kind of videos, must have been around the Olympics, when we were looking at British cycling, and there was Chris Hoy cycling in training until he was throwing up. And you kind of think, I think we've been sold this narrative of that's what it takes, that's necessary. And you kind of think, I guess, you know, when you're in that environment, when that's your environment, I think these things can be normalized. But if we just kind of step back from it and strip away kind of the winning the medals and the glory and all those things, is that healthy? Is that appropriate? Or is that crossing into that barrier of into the space of, you know, are we potentially causing issues for people here? You know, are we crossing a line? And again, I think people get kind of touchy and a bit like, oh, well, you know, that's how we do things and that's what kind of gets us medals, which I can understand. But equally, we want to try and bring into now, again, a bit more of that critical lens and thinking how we're doing things. So things like restricting eating is hopefully an obvious one that it is not good. Pain, thinking of that sacrifice, whether that's, you know, your personal life as well, all of those things. And to some extent, yes, you know, like we said, you're not going to have probably such a crazy social life as people who aren't training to be elite athletes. But there again, it is that balance of, you know, do they have absolutely nothing else outside that sport, and how healthy is that? So trying to kind of think about these characteristics and think, are any of those glorified as part of being an elite athlete, and perhaps should they be? But I just wanted to kind of cover a couple of those points, because these kind of fictional beliefs can create and encourage that stigma when it comes to, I guess, seeking help for your mental health, and maybe speaking out and saying, you know, this isn't good for me. So I think that can cause issues around that. But does anyone want to kind of feed in, add anything, or any questions on any of that at all at this point? No? Okay.
Erin, I think the one that resonates with me is the one around the restriction of eating. Is really, really interesting one. I don't know if anybody else watched the Freddie Flintoff documentary that was on last month. I thought that was really, really interesting around just almost that hidden mental health issue in a way, because he was just the sort of person that you would never expect to have that type of issue, whether it's mental health or it was bulimia as it was for him, but just almost those hidden problems that we don't see. And that's perhaps because of some of that public stigma and self-stigma that you talk about, that people hide it away because they don't feel they should talk about it, and they don't feel they should show that level of weakness, if that's what it could be perceived as. Yeah,
definitely. And I think, you know, even there, hope you don't mind, just to pick you up on something you phrased, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, but it's just highlighting what I said earlier, when you say, you know, it's a mental health issue, which it is, you're right. But then to me, to think bulimia, in my head, I'm thinking that's a mental illness, you know, like anorexia and depression. And so again, it's kind of thinking, I think because we don't want to say Freddie Flintoff has a mental illness, you sort of think, oh, that's serious, but it is serious, you know. And I do think when we need to talk about things in that way, you know, it is just sort of making sure we are putting it across in that way. But I can understand it is a mental health issue, you're right. But again, I think that's why perhaps sometimes when we come and say, let's do talk on mental health, people go, oh, they're kind of thinking mental health issues and kind of thinking down that end again. But yeah, you're definitely right in what you're saying, you know, and we'll come on to this in a minute. You don't expect someone like that to have a mental illness like that. You know, you kind of, And I think that again comes back to that athlete identity and how we've built that up and what we think an athlete is or should be. But no, that is really interesting, and we'll come on to that in a second. But yeah, I definitely think, 100% that will be down to that stigma. How is he going to be perceived? Would he ever have kind of come out and admitted to that during his career? Probably not. And when we think about, well, why is that? It's because largely, does as a coach or as someone who needs to pick a team want to pick somebody who has a mental illness? And sadly, the fact is often no, but often that's because there's not enough education around how you can actually support people with mental health challenges or mental illnesses. And I think this is why we really need to kind of open up that conversation, because of course, individuals with mental illness can be very highly functioning in a lot of ways. It's just getting them the support they need to kind of get through those challenging moments. But no, that's a really good point, and nice to bring in some kind of real world context as well. Cool. So as you kind of alluded to there, so that fits in quite nicely. When we think about sort of that mental health stigma in sport, really thinking about that athletic identity, thinking about how do we portray sport, what's the narrative, how do we market it, thinking about that kind of Olympic motto, faster, higher, stronger. Of course, it's elite sport, it is about that performance, it's about pushing boundaries, pushing ourselves and thinking, what are we actually capable of? And that is important, and we don't, again, expect people to kind of lose sight of that at all. But it is thinking about these kind of words that come up when we think of athletes. So it might be strength, might be resilience, which we've heard today, success, undefeatable, superhuman. I'm pretty sure that was one of the words for, I think, one of the Paralympics, was that they were superhumans. And it's kind of like, are they, or are they just humans who are really great at what they do? Do we need to kind of put everyone on that pedestal of they're completely above us? They're above us in so many ways. Yes, in terms of their sporting skill, but actually by putting them on those pedestals, does it make it harder for athletes to then come down and say, actually, I'm really struggling? I've had kind of depressive episodes over lockdown because I've not been able to compete. Does that make it more difficult for them because we've built up that big identity? And so again, mental health, as we're saying, is often linked to that mental illness, so people don't want to talk about it. And we might have words that you mentioned, Liam, so things like weakness, might be problematic, thinking of all these kind of different terms that you might have heard around people with mental health issues or mental illnesses. And I think, probably one of the big ones in sport maybe is unpredictable. When we're thinking about performance, we want it to be consistent. We want it to be predictable in a sense. We want to kind of know, who we're picking for the team and are they going to be reliable? And so I think often, we think of people with mental health issues and we think they could be unpredictable. Again, I think that's often how, people with mental illness can be portrayed in the media or on the TV, things that we're watching or things that, we're listening to. And so what happens is we get, like Liam was saying, really, that misconception that kind of requiring that support is a weakness. It goes against that athlete identity, which again is probably why we sit there and think, oh gosh, we didn't expect him to, have bulimia, have a mental illness, have issues, because again we've got that identity in our minds that he's strong and he's successful and he must be resilient and he must be great at everything, and that kind of isn't always the case. And again, this prevents help-seeking behaviours, because it's then obviously harder to kind of come out and say, actually, I need that support. And so what we need to think about is, the importance of the kind of language we use, how they affect how people think and they behave, and it changes attitudes. So we really want to be thinking about how we're communicating about mental health and mental illness and day to day. And I think, again, that can feel quite daunting, but I think just little changes, little bits of kind of self-awareness, someone mentioned earlier, in terms of how we're just approaching the topic and approaching people when talking or thinking about mental health is kind of really important. But did anyone want to sort of add any thoughts on that at all, or any questions on any of that? No? Okay.
So those last few points you've made there, around the help seeking behaviours and the wording.
Yeah.
Really, again, and without labouring the point, that the Freddie Flintoff one was really interesting, because he said there was one point in his career when the England staff brought in a nutritionist. And he said that was, he decided at that point he was going to talk to this nutritionist and he was going to discuss his you know, the problem he was having. And he said she sat down and literally the first thing she said was, I'm used to working with athletes, but I've worked in swimming and gymnastics before, where I've had to deal with their eating disorders, and looking around the room, I can see that's not going to be a problem here. And he said that just took the wind out of his sails and just stopped him in his tracks. He said he was all ready to discuss it with her. And he said from that point on, he just said, no, I'm not even going to consider it. So it's a really, really interesting one, that just a bit of a throwaway comment or something that you can say might change an athlete's attitude completely to coming forward and discussing this.
Definitely. No, that's really interesting. And I think, again, you know, it is about thinking as well. With a lot of these things, we don't always know the symptoms or signs. We don't always, you know, I think people with mental illness can actually get quite good at hiding it as well because of that stigma. They probably feel like they have to kind of conceal it. I mean, particularly things like eating disorders. So yeah, that is a sort of really interesting point, and it just kind of reminds us all really just to kind of go in and be kind of non-assuming, I guess, you know, until someone kind of comes to you with what they're dealing with. But no, that is a really interesting point, and I guess, you know, does just highlight the kind of failings really that we've probably had for many years, I'm sure, in sport in terms of well-being and you know, safeguarding and all those things that are starting to really kind of come out now. Which obviously it's a good thing that we're talking about them more, obviously reflecting on lots of things that have happened in sport, not always directly sort of this kind of thing like mental health related, but obviously things that can really impact your mental health. And so I think, again, you know, it's about pulling sport off the pedestal as well. I think we often have that sort of view, especially things like the Olympics, and myself included probably, where it's this shining, you know, great event that nothing bad ever happens unless you obviously don't win your medal. And, you know, these are the kind of best people. And you think there's actually a lot more going on in these organisations than we kind of care to realise, I think, sometimes. So yeah, definitely sort of being aware of kind of how we're managing those situations. But no, that's really interesting. Okay, so move this out of the way. So again, I've kind of put across 10 minutes, but I'm kind of conscious of time, and it was, again, because we had separate groups. But I just wanted kind of everyone to sort of share what you feel your role is in terms of maybe supporting athletes with mental health and well-being. So for you, how do you think it fits in for you? Maybe how you feel you already do it, or maybe kind of going away from today, what you might be thinking about within your role, or kind of any challenges you think that you sort of face within your role with this kind of area. And I just kind of wanted to bring this up just to kind of get a feel for how you guys feel in terms of actually having to go away and try and implement some bits in your day-to-day role, and kind of how you feel about that, really.
Yeah, so I'll kick us off if that's all right. From a coach perspective anyway, it's going back to Liam's point about the Freddie Flintoff, it's that communication that you, as you do more of these workshops and become aware of it, is how you sort of reflect on how you've coached before and how you might change it for the future. And I think that's kind of a challenge, is to sort of change what you've done for years or done for a while or got used to, and sort of being more accepting of like those throwaway comments that you might just use. It actually means something to somebody, and I think that's one of the challenges in terms of communication with athletes, and the fact that you're probably one of the first port of calls in terms of if an athlete has a trouble. It might be mental health, it might be something else that they can come to you and sort of discuss with you. If you're sort of, you have to open yourself up to that and just sort of try and change your practices, and from the knowledge you have about the safeguarding this mental health type stuff, and actually applying it is really key, but also quite a challenge at the same time.
Yeah,
I
was going to say, how do you kind of feel about that? You know, I think sometimes people can feel kind of thrown in at the deep end a little bit, just because, like you say, you know, you don't know what people are going to kind of come at you with. But how do you kind of feel sort of going back into that environment and sort of trying to help people manage these scenarios?
So that's a good question. I think I would be fairly happy doing it, purely because I know, well, I haven't had any like formal training in terms of mental health, but I think that if you just understand yourself that you're not there to fix it, you have to sort of signpost and sort of be willing just to get that athlete to take their first few steps and talk. I think if you get them to do that and be that sort of familiar, welcome, open, and non sort of judging face, then if they talk to you, then you can just sort of signpost and help them out as long as they've done that first step. I think that's key to helping them in the future or getting it fixed.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you've said there, I think is really important and really interesting, and something I was going to reiterate anyway, is I think sometimes people can come away from things like this and thinking, oh God, I'm going to have to go out and do all these things now. And actually a lot of it is just being a bit more aware, being able to signpost people to the sort of helpful directions, and actually not feeling like you need to kind of fix everyone's problems and you need to know all the answers, because often that will put you under more pressure as well. And I think it's sort of not necessary. I think sometimes people think, gosh, someone's going to come to me, I'm going to have all the answers about their eating disorder. Absolutely not. I wouldn't expect myself to have all the answers on that either, because that's not in my remit, which we'll come on to in a moment. So definitely I think it's about just being aware that it's not about you having to fix everything. It's about you being there, like you said, to support that person and point them in that right direction. But yeah, it's a really, really good point. Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else kind of want to go and talk about kind of their role within athlete mental health?
I think sometimes as a coach, certainly in football, one of the things that I find is football is kind of synonymous with this kind of dressing room and on-field banter type kind of reputation that it has. And as a coach, it's kind of knowing where or trying to understand where those limits might be, that what is banter and what players can say to each other, and to a certain extent you as a coach can join in with, and where that line is that you've got to kind of say, right, that's where either as a group that's where it stops, or maybe identifying those one or two players that maybe, it might be more than one or two, but those players that maybe don't quite have that same level of I don't want to say resilience, because that makes it sound like it's a weakness on their part, but where they may feel that those comments and that banter is stepping over the mark, and you've got to kind of be able to identify that and make sure that, one, it doesn't go beyond that level, and two, that if you spot something you feel you needs dealing with, either you can deal with it, or you can then maybe, as Max has just commented about, signposting people onto where they might kind of get any support that they may need. But I think that's a really tricky one, particularly in team sports, is because you've got so many personalities that some people will be giving it out, some people will be taking it, some people are doing a bit of a both, some people can take it really well, some people can't, and you've got to be able to deal with maybe 20 personalities in one group.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right. And I think when you're kind of searching for a word there, I think it's just about individual differences, really, isn't it? It's just differences in how people manage it. I think we all know what you mean in terms of some people are happy to go along with that kind of thing. Some people just aren't like that. I think, some people just don't kind of receive it well or just gel with it. And I think you're definitely right. It's about being aware. And I think in sort of particularly in kind of a coaching role, I think all you can do at that point, again, don't take it all on yourself if you have to know the ins and outs of everybody and monitor everybody, but trying to get across to yourself and the team that actually, let's all try and be kind of self-aware. Let's try and be self-aware of ourselves and each other and how we're different. And if, you're having a bit of a joke with somebody and, they're taking it fine, then fine. And if you're having a joke and you're kind of picking up and actually it's not going down that well, they're not really engaging, okay, maybe just thinking about backing off a little bit and just, bearing that in mind. And so I think for me, it's about, again, kind of just encouraging people to try and be self-aware, just be considerate, just be, mindful that people handle things in different ways and work in different ways. and just trying to kind of build that in probably into the environment. So it's not necessarily saying, you know, I'm the coach, it's down to me to regulate everything, but actually getting the team themselves to try and sort of regulate that and becoming more self-aware. You know, if it's children, that's a great skill to learn. If it's adults, hopefully they'll kind of, possibly not, but be kind of doing that a little bit in day-to-day life anyway. So just trying to kind of encourage everybody to share that responsibility, I would say. But yeah, definitely an interesting one in terms of how you see your role kind of fitting in that. But yeah, does anyone else kind of want to share how they see sort of their role fitting in, or maybe any challenges within sort of athlete mental health and kind of your role in particular?
I think another thing you just said there, which resonates with me, Erin, is that the differences, the individual differences you talk about. Because again, one of the things that I'm conscious of when I'm coaching, the players that I coach are players with cerebral palsy, and you know, even within the session, kind of physically and technically and tactically, there's many differences within those players. Some of them are more affected by their disability than others. You know, there's different classifications within that group that I have to deal with, and you know, some of the players physically might be able to cope with something that some of the other players might really struggle with because of the impacts of their disability. And sometimes I have to really be conscious of the sessions that I'm putting on. Do they meet the needs of the players? Am I pairing players up correctly? Am I putting on sessions that kind of meet everybody's needs? But also then encouraging those players that actually, if they are struggling with the session, that might be down to their disability, and actually they've got to compare themselves to other people in their classification, not necessarily the best player in the group, because they're important to us in terms of a team within their classification banding, and not just their ability in comparison to the other players within that group. And actually they may be one of the most important players in that group, because they might be in a classification where we find it difficult to find players of their ability within that classification, but it doesn't necessarily make them the strongest player in the group.
That makes sense. And again, I think you've made a good link there. It is about those individual differences, and I think just as you'd consider that in terms of the physicality of things and how you're you know, running the session, it's also just being aware of that mentally, whether that is from a mental health perspective or just from, like you say, like that interaction and how they like to socially interact with the team, and you know, managing sort of those almost personality differences as well, I think is a really key point. And I think you've made quite a nice kind of link there of, you know, often with a lot of these things, we consider it in terms of the physical side of things, but we don't then maybe think about it the same when we're looking at kind of the mental side. So I think it is trying to kind of consider the mental side of things as much as we do when we're sort of making allowances or adapting things physically as well. No, that's all good. Cool. Okay, thank you for sharing. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of run through just some kind of key things to think about when we're looking at kind of the staff role in athlete mental health. Some of the things you'll have no doubt kind of touched on already, but I just wanted to kind of mention a few pointers to give you kind of food for thought, really. So one of the kind of first things that I'd always say is, you know, consider that person behind the performer. And again, you know, particularly moving into elite sport, it can be difficult to kind of separate that sometimes, particularly if you're a coach in that role where you are kind of looking to get those performance results. But I'd say, you know, really try and consider the person first and an athlete second is what we always kind of say in psychology, if that's kind of your way of working, I guess. So really trying to think about that and think about what that means for how you interact with people and how you consider their mental health. And again, you know, encouraging those conversations about mental health and well-being. And I think it doesn't always, again, have to be these really kind of big conversations where we're all going to talk about our sort of mental health history and the ins and outs of our personal lives. But it can just be sort of little conversations about, you know, how are you doing? Like, how have you kind of dealt with lockdown this year? You know, is a kind of classic one, particularly when players are returning to training or returning to competing. It is going to be a big one. as I know a lot of sports, if not most sports, aren't competing at the moment. So just having those sort of basic conversations, how are you doing? How did you find it? And trying to sort of encourage those conversations in any of the populations that you work with. As Max said earlier, so signpost, one of the key things is trying to point them in the right direction of who they can go to for support. Learning more about mental health as well, so hopefully you'll find today sort of informative and useful, but also looking at how you can keep learning more about it, particularly in sort of the sporting environment. Trying to create a balanced environment, so thinking about process and performance. So a lot of the work I do with coaches and athletes as well is looking at their process focus, how they can focus on things technically, tactically, mentally to help them perform at their best, and maybe shift away from that really intense performance and result focus where it may kind of slip into being detrimental. And I think that kind of comes back to what Liam was saying earlier in the session, where we kind of have, we need to put athletes under pressure or put people under pressure to try and get them to perform, but also actually how do we balance that with process, with development, with skill development. And I think trying to create a balanced environment is really helpful for that. And again, I think there can be some sort of reluctance from coaches to kind of not have performance and results at the forefront of their mind all the time, because that obviously is really important. And I think, again, it's not about sacrificing those performance results. It's actually by realising if we can get our athletes to focus on the process, really get the process right, get their mental health and well-being in order as well as part of that, then that performance will come, and that goes hand in hand. So really trying to just be aware of that. Taking mental health as seriously as physical health, something that I'm sure you often hear, most of us kind of go to the doctors if we need it, if we have some sort of physical illness or issue, but people are a lot more reluctant, obviously, to do that with mental health because of things like stigma or uncertainty on what that might involve. So really just trying to kind of consider it as much, I would say, as you would do kind of physical health and physical performance as well. Work with people like sort of mental health officers or kind of wellbeing officers. I'm sure like a lot of organisations now seem to kind of have those people in place to try and work with them and other key stakeholders. So whether that's other coaches, it might be parents as well, I think is often a key stakeholder that we don't sort of work with and embrace enough for various reasons. But trying to work with all the people in your environment, again, to kind of have that integrated approach to looking at mental health and wellbeing. Mental health is everyone's business, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but trying to, think about you and your role and how you can implement certain things or set the tone in the environment, and just being aware that, it's not necessarily just because you have a mental health or wellbeing officer doesn't mean it should be their sole responsibility, because often in my experience those people are sort of off and away and they're not always in the environment. They're there if you need them, but they might not always be seeing things day to day, whereas you might in your role. So trying to keep that in mind. And then, of course, look after yourselves as well as your athletes. That's a really important point. Particularly this year, I think people just generally are kind of struggling mentally in a lot of ways. So just trying to make sure you're looking after yourself and seeking the support you might need before you're kind of helping others, really. Does anyone want to kind of add anything to those points, discuss anything around it, or have any questions at all? No? Okay, so as I said, so we want to think about mental health being everybody's business. So again, consider maybe having one or two individuals. Obviously, I know everyone in different roles has different sort of influence in your organisation, but there could be a couple of people who already or who could actively monitor kind of the mental health and wellbeing. Again, you might have those wellbeing officers who might manage, monitor and evaluate kind of the structure of supporting athletes. But try and think about what is done in your organisation or your team, wherever you're working, what's done to increase athlete and staff awareness of mental health and wellbeing. Is an open dialogue encouraged, and is there sort of that main point of contact? And even if there is, does everybody know about it, or do just some people know about it because they, been made aware of it, but they've not really passed out that info? So trying to kind of think about think about that. Okay. So moving on to some kind of final points in terms of what you want to be thinking about. So kind of a clear thing, kind of like communication. So trying to create that safe space for discussion is a big one. And again, you know, going back to what Liam was saying with kind of Freddie Flintoff, you know, did that nutritionist not actually make that a safe space for discussion because they went in there and said something that's actually really impacted how he's now going to interact with them. Regular athlete and staff check-ins. So thinking about that, particularly if you're in a coaching role, how can you sort of integrate that? Or I know obviously some other people are working with kind of people at maybe grassroots level or just at participation level, checking in with those individuals to see how they're getting on. Again, encouraging those help-seeking behaviours. So trying to make sure that, again, we're kind of setting up that environment where people can feel like they can kind of reach out for support to whoever that might be. And also maybe sharing how you feel, if you're obviously comfortable to do that, and try and role model behaviours. So this might be a kind of typical example, you know, if you're going back to training or competing after kind of lockdown and not being able to do that, maybe just asking people how they're feeling about it and sharing, you know, how you're feeling or how you managed over lockdown and things like that, and just trying to kind of have those very simple, often, you know, conversations, just to kind of role model the behaviour of, we can come here and we can talk about these things and that's fine. And I think a kind of key point, and this is something that somebody said in a workshop I was in on mental health actually really recently that I found really interesting, was they're saying obviously communication is key, and we're all doing a lot of work around, you know, getting people to communicate more about mental health and well-being, but we also now need to act on things. You know, it's kind of, we're getting to the point, and I mean, the workshop I was in was for kind of practitioners, like psychology practitioners in particular, but it's kind of, we're getting to the point where just talking about it now isn't enough. We need to start kind of acting on these things and really starting putting things in place. So really needing to kind of think about our role within that. And then within that, we want to think about our environment and how we're setting the tone. And again, obviously different roles will have different influences over that, but particularly from a coaching perspective, I think you can have quite a good influence. So thinking about how this sporting environment can sort of nourish or malnourish athlete mental health. Consider practices within your sporting environment. So some examples that will come up here might be particularly kind of towards that severe end again, but just to kind of illustrate the point. So thinking about, do you have that sort of win at all costs mentality, and what's the impact of that? Thinking about things like early specialisation, if you work within youth sport, if you will do at some point, you know, how early do we encourage children to, you know, have that tunnel vision as such? Training while injured, hopefully that's not something that's encouraged, but can be, you know, obviously in some sporting environments, is that toughness, you know, carrying on and sacrificing and going through pain. Pressure to forego kind of academic pursuits and non-sport friendships, as sort of Max was saying earlier, you know, often it's a choice between a couple of things that you can balance. So thinking about how are we kind of setting the tone for that, and what's the impact? And things like that, intense training without sufficient recovery. So if we're looking at things like that, again, hopefully then with more sort of severe end where things are sort of going a little bit wrong, but I think little things can kind of creep in without us maybe always being aware of them. And this would sort of malnourish athlete mental health. But of course, environments can also nourish athlete mental health. And it's been found in research that young athletes who think their talent development environments are high quality actually report higher well-being. So it's thinking about these kind of things. So we want the environment to be integrated, we want it to be values-based. We want you to send clear messages in that environment and make sure that you're engaging in practices that are coherent with these values. And I think it's quite a big thing nowadays to have these sort of values and philosophies and words on a wall that you've printed and done all these things, which is great and it's good work, but it's trying to make sure that actually you're living by those values, so they're not just that sort of kind of cool tick box kind of exercise that I think can happen sometimes. So making sure that you're engaging in those practices, allowing for those multiple identities. So again, that kind of comes back to that balance. and trying to empower athletes as well. And I think a big part of that is sort of this self-awareness and getting them to think about how they can kind of support themselves, how they can reach out to other people for that help and feel empowered to do that, rather than feel like they're kind of stuck in their situation and they can't really do anything about it. And I think really trying to consider mental health as a key indicator of effectiveness. So if we think about all of these sort of measurements that we have, like Charlotte was saying earlier, all this analysis that we do on performance, starting to think about mental health as that key indicator of whether your environment's effective, I think is really important. And so maybe just kind of going away from today, kind of thinking about, is your environment a resource for athlete mental health? So just to kind of follow up on that. So want to think about, again, this is kind of coming back to my process focus I mentioned earlier. So thinking about, is that environment that you maybe set, particularly as a coach, I guess at this point, task oriented? Are you focusing on development and that process? Are you encouraging growth in lots of different areas? So obviously performance growth, but other key skills as well. Do you have an athlete-centered approach? So really building the environment around them. And I guess like Liam was saying earlier, adapting your training for athletes' requirements and their capabilities and things like that. And then thinking again about that kind of person first, athlete second. And that's, also obviously relevant when you're working at sort of more that grassroots level, thinking about that person, getting them into that physical activity, and thinking them obviously not necessarily as an athlete, but thinking about them as a person, maybe thinking about what are those barriers to them exercising, why are they reluctant, trying to understand that before we're then trying to kind of encourage them to be physically active. So this maintains mental health, well-being, and supports performance. So again, it's kind of making that link. Okay. Then we've just got a brief bit of information on signposting. So we want to think about appropriate kind of referral pathways. And these can be different in organisations. Some organisations don't have them, some are maybe just forming them, and some are kind of really well established. So try and consider, what do you do currently if an athlete requires support? Are you aware of any relevant procedures in place? And are athletes made aware of these procedures and processes? And at this point, I've put in a breakout room. I'm conscious of time. But does anyone want to just kind of feed in on this? Is there anything that you want to add, whether you feel that there are processes and procedures you're aware of, or whether you feel like there isn't enough awareness at all?
I think, again, from my point of view, working in the environment that I work in, Erin, I do feel that I'm very lucky that I do work within an elite organisation within the FA that has all this in place. It'll be a little bit different if you're working with maybe just a local club, or you're working with maybe at a lower level, so to speak. You might not have this in place. It might be something that for kind of local clubs and things like that, it might be something that they need to consider, and how they would put that in place might be quite a challenge. But yeah, certainly from my point of view, I feel I'm quite lucky in that. Yeah,
definitely.
I think in terms of a uni perspective, there's support for like the top athletes, but then anything else, there's not really that much other than a welfare sort of representative in the club. Other than that, I don't think there's that much. And I think it's at uni, it's not so much of a sort of focused on subject or aspect of training, just from the uni's perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can just show, even just there in those two examples, the differences in the kind of setup. And I guess again, it's trying to think about, when you are going back to your organisations, I guess particularly maybe for you, Max, if there isn't that setup there so much, what could you do in your role to try and help in that scenario? I'm not necessarily saying you have to try and single-handedly go and create a referral pathway, because that is challenging, but maybe just being aware of, are there people in the university who could look at that. Could you talk to somebody and say, actually, you know, this would be something really helpful for my athletes, can we consider it? You know, often there's quite a few, I'm speaking, I guess I'm at Loughborough, but there's quite a few obviously psychologists and people like that are working in the university anyway, so trying to maybe think about could that be sort of something you put in place, and again, obviously outside the university, just trying to think, I suppose, you know, how can you do the best you can with the situation you've got, essentially, and trying to kind of manage that, which I think can be difficult. But I think just, if nothing else, you know, trying to, if there are any procedures, if there is anybody that you can go to, even if it's just, I know universities do like counselling and things like that outside of sport, even just making them aware of that, of like Nightline and things like that, is like a really kind of a good place to start. But yeah, definitely can kind of respect that there are different systems in place, which can be a challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll give that a go.
Right. No pressure. I'm not going to check up on you in a few months' time to see if you have. Oh dear. But okay, so thinking about signposting appropriately. So obviously it's important for you to know where you and other people can receive that support. So thinking about, is there a welfare officer? There might be someone in your team, in your institution, just somebody, hopefully. Could be a sports psychologist, could be a first point of contact, someone who would support with mental health and wellbeing, so someone maybe like myself. So again, you know, the FA, we have a team doctor who kind of comes to camps with us and travels with us. So again, we're quite fortunate that we would then, or I would potentially liaise with them and work with them if an athlete was having particular mental health challenges. A clinical psychologist, you might be able to kind of, obviously, again, depends on your kind of setup, but it might be helpful to have some sort of connection to that. I know there's organisations, I think the FA uses Sporting Chance, isn't it? And that's who sort of we refer to. So trying to think, okay, could we even just point people in the direction of these kind of places to see what's there? And then obviously things like your GP, either through the NHS or privately, which I guess, as with everything, has its own challenges. But just trying to kind of be aware of those options, and again, you know, this might be different for you, but going throughout your career, you might be in a different environment that does have this kind of setup. So just being sort of aware of this and thinking, how can I even put a small bit of this in place where possible, would be really helpful. And I think just a point that kind of Max really touched on earlier, of feeling like you don't have to necessarily have the answers. It's important for anybody in any of these types of roles to really recognise and stay within their remit, and this goes for me as well. So, you know, I wouldn't, for example, work with the client on a kind of clinical illness. So it might be an eating disorder, for example, might be quite a common one in sport. I wouldn't work with an athlete necessarily on that directly. So I might work with them on maybe some of the sporting aspects of it and liaise with somebody more appropriate. So that would be a GP who would refer you on to probably a clinical psychologist. So obviously, if you are a coach, you know, trying to think about what is your role within that, not necessarily trying to solve these problems, because you know, we just need to make sure that we're qualified to kind of do so, and that's for everybody in this environment, really. Finally, I just wanted to briefly mention mental health literacy. So it's kind of a big thing, and something I'm looking at with my PhD of, you know, actually having sessions like this and people kind of going out there and hopefully learning about mental health and mental illness, and whether that does have an impact on then what they go and do. So thinking about how to obtain and maintain positive mental health, trying to understand mental health problems and their treatments, decreasing that stigma related to mental health problems that we've talked about quite a lot today, and encouraging those help-seeking behaviours. So just flagging up there just a couple of places that you could find information on this. So we've obviously got the mental health first aid course. I haven't personally done it, but I've heard very good things about it, and I probably should do it at some point. So trying to be more proactive than me and going and doing that, if you haven't already, that's particularly useful. Thinking about charities like kind of Mind and organisations. The BPS, so that is kind of more for psychologists, but they often do sort of events like this, CPD events, and BASES as well, obviously, sort of more broadly sports science? Do they have any workshops you could go to, and just things where you can get more involved and just learn more about this topic, essentially, to essentially really arm you with the best knowledge you can to support people. Okay, we've made it. So summary and next steps to think about. So remember to think about that key difference between mental health and mental illness, the importance of defining that, having a clear idea on what you mean and what other people mean about mental health and mental illness when you're discussing it with athletes, fellow coaches, parents, whoever it might be. Consider mental health as a resource, so really try and link it and encourage others as well, particularly coaches, to link mental health as a resource with that performance, because I think that's often the way to motivate people in sport to get more mindful of mental health, is to kind of, I guess, go around it and sell the benefits of. Obviously it helps with performance, but I'd like to think that people obviously want to help people as well, not just as athletes. Be mindful of the challenges to athlete mental health and the challenges that athletes will face. Try to play your part in reducing stigma, and a big part of that will be considering your role in supporting athlete mental health and well-being, and really start the conversation. And we've had some really interesting insights and conversations today, so thank you very much for that. But also let your actions do the talking. Go out and try and implement things and think how you can do things slightly differently. Okay, so that's it from me. Any kind of questions, final thoughts, other things that we just wanted to mention before we kind of wrap up the session at all?
I think from my point of view, Erin, it's been really, really useful. Obviously, as I say, I've been quite fortunate that I've been able to work with sports psychologists in the role that I do in coaching. But it's made me think a little bit more in terms of my role and how I can support that psychologist in their role, particularly in terms of me delivering my sessions, but also just interactions with the players when we're together as well. So it's almost a case of, whether I'm on the pitch or off the pitch, I'm considering the players' mental health and mental well-being, as well as just them being an athlete, like you say, just thinking a little bit deeper of that support, both on and off the pitches. I think it's been really, really useful for me.
Good. And I think definitely, just to kind of pick up on a point you said there, working with a psychologist, if you are fortunate enough, although that sounds a bit bad coming from me as one, but fortunate enough to have a sports psych on obviously your team, that will be a real benefit to them, to have you as a coach wanting to kind of integrate their work with your work. It definitely makes it more impactful. So I really think that is kind of worthwhile, but glad it's been useful and hopefully insightful. If there's sort of no other kind of questions or discussion points, then obviously you can get in touch. My details are up there. And if you kind of want to chat about anything or ask any questions or whatever, then feel free to get in touch. And I think there's one more slide. Oh, there we go. So so there we go.